And this afternoon, the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull joined 7:30 from Adelaide. Prime Minister, thank you for coming in.
Good evening.
France already has a submarine production facility. It's built more than 100 subs there. It's exported them to 9 countries. And yet the Australian government is building this local facility here so that sub-building work can be done in Australia. Given the cost premium involved, how is this move not a social welfare program at odds with your free market government?
Well, let me say this to you, Lee. It is absolutely critical that as far as possible, every dollar that we spend on defence procurement is spent here in Australia, because that drives Australian economic growth and Australian jobs. It drives Australian technology, drives advanced manufacturing and all of the spin-offs that comes from that. You see, the defence industry operates at the very frontier of innovation and technology, and so it serves to pull the rest of the economy along in that regard. There's a lot of spin-off benefits. So yes, we have a sovereign defence force, and we should have a sovereign defence industry with construction here, wherever possible, in Australia.
I take your point regarding the spin-off benefits, but how much extra is it costing to do the work here in Australia rather than having it all done in France and then exported here?
Well, can I just say to you, all 3 bidders nominated the cost, an order of magnitude, what's called a rough order of magnitude, between building overseas and building in Australia. Such premium as there is very manageable.
And what was it exactly in dollar figures?
I can't go into that with you at this stage, Lee, I can assure you. But let me just say this to you. You've got to remember that these are very complex pieces of machinery. They need to be sustained and maintained in Australia. They need to be built in Australia. And it is a vital part of our national economic plan, our plan to ensure that we have the jobs and growth in the 21st century economy, that we successfully transition from an economy that's been fuelled up by a mining construction boom to one that is more diverse. And our defence white paper, our defence investment plan is all part of our overall plan for a strong 21st century economy.
How much of each submarine will be actually built in South Australia?
Well, the submarines will be built in South Australia, and the bulk of the components, the elements in the submarine, will be built in South Australia and elsewhere in Australia. But of course, as with any product of advanced manufacturing in the 21st century, there is a global supply chain, and there will be elements, components that are built in the United States or supplied from France. But the majority, the bulk of it, will be built in Australia and indeed here in South Australia.
And when you say the majority, do you mean, 55% of them will be built in Australia or 95% of them? Is it substantially, is it basically the whole thing, or is it, about half?
Lee, let me restate what my objective is. I am committed to Australia having the strongest defence capability we can afford to keep us safe. Behind that, we need a strong defence industry. And so wherever we can spend the dollars we commit to getting the capabilities for our defence forces in Australia, wherever we can spend those dollars in Australia, we will. So these submarines...
Sorry to interrupt, but to test the veracity of what you're saying, what I'm asking is how much of these submarines will be built in Australia? Is it 90%? Is it 50%?
Well, Lee, the submarine has not yet been designed. So we are working with the French as a design partner. It is going to be based on their latest submarine, their Barracuda submarine, but it is going to be an Australian-French partnership to design a new submarine, and the majority of the construction, all of the construction and the majority of the components, the work that goes into that will be built in Australia. That's our policy, that's our commitment, and that's what you'd expect.
What do you say to the suggestion from your enemies that this announcement is about shoring up your political position in South Australia?
The competitive evaluation process was extremely thorough, as we described today, as the Defence Minister described in the press conference today. And what we had was unambiguous advice from our Defence Department, from the independent experts, naval submarine experts that assisted us, unambiguous advice that the French proposal represented the best capabilities for our unique needs. Now, the proposals from Germany and from Japan were excellent and had great capabilities, but the French one was the superior one for our needs, and that is why we're proceeding with it.
Just one quick question before we move off this. Have you spoken personally to the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe about this?
Yes, I have.
And what was the content of the conversation broadly?
Well, can I say to you that in all of my discussions with Prime Minister Abe, including the most recent one, each of us shared our unwavering commitment to our strong, special strategic partnership with Japan, which will become stronger in the years ahead.
Nonetheless,
and
Japan's
part of
put out
that
a
is our
statement to say this is deeply regrettable.
relationship with the United States.
The Japanese have put out a statement to say that this decision is deeply regrettable.
Well, it is. We can clearly understand their disappointment at not being successful in the competitive evaluation process.
Let's move on to negative gearing. On the weekend, you said that Labor's negative gearing and capital gains policies would take a sledgehammer to property prices. Where's your modelling for that?
Well, there has been modelling published earlier actually it was given to the Labor Party last year, in fact, by BIS Shrapnel, which
and is that the modelling you're relying on when you say that?
But let me just. This is a matter of common sense. Around a third of the buyers for residential property currently are investors. What Labor is proposing will take all or almost all of them out of the market. Now, if the residential property market is soft now and it is declining in many cities, and in Perth, for example, it's been declining for several years. If you take a third of the buyers out of the market, values will fall. That's common sense.
But you're saying, I'll come back to the common sense point in a moment, but you're saying it would take almost all of them out of the market. If you look at what's happened around the world, or what happens around the world, in countries that have far less generous capital gains tax policies than in Australia, far less generous negative gearing policies, they have vibrant property investment markets.
Well, that's not actually entirely accurate, Lee, if I can just pick you up on a couple of things. Firstly, what Labor is proposing to do is to jack up capital gains tax by 50%, and that would make it the second highest in the among comparable developed countries. Now, let me say to you, capital gains tax is a tax on investment. If you want people to do less of something, you jack up the tax. So what Labor clearly wants is less investment. Less investment means less jobs. We want to see more investment. Now, as far as property investors are concerned, in a market like the United States, where negative gearing is generally not allowed, what you see is rents being much higher, rental properties being owned by big companies and big investors. You don't have what we have in Australia, which is mum and dad investors, people on average incomes, buying a flat, buying a house. I mean, 70% of the people who negative gear in Australia own one property and another 20% own two. Most of these Australians are hard-working Australians trying to get ahead. Most of them are on average earnings or less.
Well,
and
actually,
the Labor Party wants to take them out of the market.
The statistics that the top 10% of income earners receiving three-quarters of taxable... Sorry, it's the top 10% of income earners who are receiving three-quarters of taxable capital gains.
Well, Lee, that's beside the point. Of course, people on the highest incomes will make the highest gains because they tend to have more property.
Well, so therefore, these policies favour most people who are on the highest incomes.
Lee, there are well over 1 million Australians, most of whom are on average earnings, who have an investment property and they are negative gearing it.
And how many Australians does that leave who don't have that? What, 22, 23 million?
I'm sorry, Lee, I couldn't hear that question.
I said, how many Australians does that leave who aren't involved with negative gearing? I don't know what the population is, another 21, 22 million?
Well, there are obviously many Australians that don't invest in property. But does that mean that you should ban all Australians from being able to do it? And let me just go on, Lee. Let me give you a very good business example. Labor wants to ban negative gearing on any asset except new dwellings. So that includes commercial property. That includes shares. That includes business assets. Now, what possible point is there in preventing you from investing in a shop, and negative gearing that. That is simply a Labor tax grab. It's got nothing to do with housing affordability.
On housing affordability, on the weekend when you announced that you wouldn't change negative gearing, you were there with a family with a young baby. The subtext of what you were saying was that, OK, sure, maybe you can't afford to buy your own house to live in, but here's what you can aspire to. You can keep living with mum and dad and buy an investment property, and maybe one day your children might be able to afford to buy a property of their own. Is that the sort of country that you see Australia becoming?
Australia is a country where people should be able to exercise their economic freedom and invest where they wish. Negative gearing, the ability to offset interest expenses from an income-earning investment against your personal income, that has been part of our tax law since 1915. It's 101 years old. It is not a tax break, it is a standard concession. Now, let me give you an example, however, of how unjust and ill thought out and reckless Labor's plan is. Under Labor's plan, a plumber who's earning $100,000 a year would not be able to negative gear an investment property or shares, for that matter, against his income as a plumber. However, a wealthy person with investment income, dividends, rents, interest of $100,000 a year would be able to negative gear against their investment income. So under Labor's plan, workers, people whose income comes from their personal exertion, will not be able to negative gear, but people whose income comes from investments will. Now, how is that fair?
When we started this section, I asked you if you could give me the modelling for your assessment that it would take a sledgehammer to property prices, and you said it's a matter of common sense. So is what you're saying to voters, I don't actually have hard evidence here, it's my common sense, and so you have to trust my analysis on this?
Well, Lee, you know, your viewers tonight understand the laws of supply and demand. If you take a third of the buyers out of a market,
but what I'm asking is, how do you know you're taking out a third?
Pardon?
Where's your modelling for the fact that you're taking out a third?
Well, again, it's a fact. We know
but
that
you've
around.
said a third. That's very specific. What are you relying on for that?
Well, if you'll let me finish, I'll give you the answer. We know from the statistics, the banking statistics and the ATO statistics, that around a third of the people who borrow borrow money to invest in property are investors, and most of them will be negative gearing. And I might say, even if they were positively geared, even if the rent of the property they were buying was higher than their interest, if under Labor's plan, they would run the risk if, for whatever reason, they incurred a net rental loss. Perhaps the tenant stopped paying rent, or the property was vacant, or it needed expensive repairs. If for whatever reason they suffered a net rental loss, they'd have to cover it out of their after-tax income. So that is a very big risk. So we can say very confidently that under Labor's plan, all or almost all of those investors, personal investors who are borrowing money to buy investment property, would not take that risk because the consequence, obviously, the expense of having to offset your net rental loss against your own income is very high. Now, if you believe, Lee, that you can take a third of the buyers out of the market, or up to a third of the buyers out of the market, and not affect prices, well, then that would be a fairy tale.
All right.
Now, if I may say so.
We're going to run out of time, and I want to ask you a quick question to finish. You've said that you intend to call the election for the 2nd of July. When will you be visiting the Governor-General to formalise that?
Well, as I've said, I'll be calling on the Governor-General to advise him to dissolve both Houses of Parliament and call an election for the 2nd of July, and I'll be visiting him after the budget, and obviously the Leader of the Opposition's reply, and that will be done, very shortly, but at an appropriate time after the budget and on or before the 11th of May.
And after the budget reply speech as well?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I said, yeah.
Prime Minister, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lee.